Recording in progress. Thank you so much for joining us for what is the latest and last seminar in our series that we've been running since January on the shame and medicine in literature. So we've been interrogating the connections between the experience of shame and its literary representations across 3 previous seminars. And we are delighted today to welcome Dr. Kaye Mitchell and to give this last seminar in our seminar series. I'm sure that I'm not the only one who works in these intersections between shame and literature and gender who finds themselves always drawn back to Kaye's monograph, Writing Shame. So it's a real delight to have you here, Kaye. Thank you very much. So by means of a more formal introduction, Dr. Kaye Mitchell is a senior lecturer in contemporary literature and director of the Centre for New Writing at the University of Manchester. She's published 3 monographs, most recently Writing Shame. Her editorial publications include a collection of essays on Sarah Waters, a special issue of Contemporary Women's Writing on experimental women's writing, and a co-edited collection of essays with Nonia Williams on British avant-garde fiction of the 1960s. Kaye was the UK editor of OUP journal Contemporary Women's Writing from 2017 to 2023 and is on the editorial board of Open Gender Journal in Germany. She held a Humboldt Experience Researcher Fellowship in Berlin from 2014 to 2015, and this has recently been renewed for a shorter return visit in 2025. And Kaye's presentation today is entitled Shame, Femininity and the Sick Woman. So over to you, Kaye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to give this talk. It's a real pleasure because this is such an important series, I think, and it's certainly a series that I've, in this longer kind of project on shame and medicine, is one that I have had my eye on for a while. So I'm going to share my screen now so that I can share my slides. This paper is a very condensed version of a longer piece about twice the length, actually. And it's the longer piece is a journal article for a special issue, and it's an article in which I begin to outline a contemporary subgenre of innovative life writing by women and non-binary writers with a focus on chronic and/or apparently undiagnosable illness. In the longer paper, I look at Amy Berkowitz, Johanna Hedver, Alice Hattrick, but I also touch on some of the other texts that I've listed here, which I see as sort of belonging to this larger category. So there's a bit of Dodie Bellamy and Anne Boyer in the longer version. In the version that I'm going to do today, the shorter version, I'm just going to look at Johanna Hedver's Sick Woman Theory and Alice Hattrick's Ill Feelings. These works, I suggest, bring to light the disparities of language and care afforded to bodies identified as female. They also experiment with genre, structure, and narrative form as they navigate the shame of being a sick woman. And what I'm trying to look at here particularly is the intersection of the shame of femininity, the shame of confessional writing, particularly a writing focused on the body, and the shame of chronic illness, so often stigmatized as malingering, as laziness, as non-productivity. As I discuss in Writing Shame, and here's a shameless plug for that book, not least because it has a very nice cover, the association between shame and femininity can be traced back at least to classical literature in the notion of aidōs, found in Freudian psychoanalysis, where, as Malcolm Pines explains, female morality is felt to be deficient in guilt and overcompensated by shame. It's found in post-Freudian psychoanalysis, for example, in Helen Block's writing on shame-proneness in women, and it's explored to rather different ends in the work of feminist theorists, philosophers, and literary critics. Indeed, what I sought to argue in Writing Shame was that shame has a kind of originary role in the production and the shaping of femininity and female subjectivity. So it doesn't just act to kind of regulate femininity or feminine propriety. I think it's actually there as part of what produces femininity as a sort of cultural construct. It therefore, I suggested, possesses a vital revelatory function. Sandra Bartky claims that shame discloses to women who they are and how they are faring. That's a claim she makes in Femininity and Domination. If that is the case, then shame is an ontological matter, properly speaking, that reveals what woman, this idea of woman, is and means in the Western cultures that are the main focus of my inquiry. Narratives of chronic illness inhabit a position of heightened vulnerability, as examples of a kind of confessional life writing that is simultaneously lauded as brave and denigrated as artless, indulgent, or oversharing, as feminine texts in various senses, and as acts of precarious, disputed testimony. The personal nature of this writing already opens it up to shaming. What further stigmatization might result from a writing focused on an illness like chronic fatigue syndrome that is at best disputed, at worst dismissed? Sylvan Tompkins' description of shame as a sickness of the soul takes on a very particular resonance in this context. In On Being Ill, Virginia Woolf wonders at illness's apparent exclusion from literature and suggests that, quote, literature does its best to maintain that its concern is with the mind, that the body is a sheet of plain glass through which the soul looks straight and clear, and, save for one or two passions such as desire and greed, is null, negligible, and non-existent. We might then deduce that the writing of the body is a kind of shameful writing. It is not literature in the sort of honorific evaluative sense. It is genre fiction, sensation, gothic, crime, with its salacious sensual focus, its dangerous bodily effects. The body, though, cannot be suppressed. All day, all night, the body intervenes, asserts Woolf, and yet, of all this daily drama of the body, there is no record. Looking back at Woolf's essay in 1991, G. Thomas Cowser contends that, quote, the suppression of bodily illness as a literary subject is related to the valorization of male over female experience. And he asks, is female to male as body is to mind and illness to health? In analysing these contemporary autobiographical texts that deal with gender and illness, I want to move beyond these rather reductive binarisms, while still acknowledging the persistent and persistently shaming association of woman with the body, and considering how this shapes illness narratives by those either identifying as or being identified by others as women, particularly when the illnesses themselves are viewed as feminized. By the 1990s, Cowser notes, quote, a flowering of what I call autopathography, autobiographical narratives of illness or disability, and he suggests that this is a sign of cultural health, an acknowledgement and an exploration of our condition as embodied selves. The subcategory of women's life writing about illness to which Hedver and Hattrick belong is, I suggest, both more formally experimental, hybridizing autobiography, essay, and theory, and more overtly politicized than mainstream illness memoirs. It also tends to resist straightforward narratives of recovery or redemption. In 2016, when Hedver first published Sick Woman Theory, Anne Boyer writes, there was this feeling that a collective project of important thinking was coming together by that force that feels like beneficial accident, but is actually always the force of history, about the sick, pained, feminized body in current conditions, that body, our bodies, so often made sick by those current conditions. This subcategory of writing, which has continued to expand since Boyer wrote this, partly overlaps with what has been called auto theory, in which, as Lauren Fournier explains, one's embodied experiences become the material through which one theorizes, and, in a similar way, theory becomes the discourse through which one's lived experience is refracted. Within the smaller subset of works that Fournier places under the heading Sick Woman Theory, taking that from Hedver's essay of the same title, she notes an attention to, quote, the delegitimization of women's pain and the interrelatedness of sexual trauma with mysterious feminized illnesses like fibromyalgia. And it's those mysterious feminized illnesses that are my particular concern, as well as, I suppose, the implications of their identification as mysterious and feminized. So as Amy Berkowitz observes in Tender Points, which is a kind of fragmentary, confessional, polemical work of auto theory about a recalled experience of child abuse and about living with chronic pain, Berkowitz says, if fibromyalgia primarily affected men, then, quote, I suspect we would see words like mysterious and unknown drop from the literature. Leslie Jameson, in her essay on the grand unified theory of female pain, writes of, quote, our Janus-faced relationship to female pain. We're attracted to it and revolted by it, proud and ashamed of it. We fear claiming this pain, she argues, due to accusations of melodrama, triviality, wallowing. And part of what interests me in what she's saying there is that the shame not only attaches to the illness and the wallowing in it, but there's a sort of aesthetic quality, an aesthetic shame there too, melodrama, the danger of sort of bad writing. The works that I'm considering here do claim that pain, even while oscillating between pride and shame in doing so. Hedver and Hattrick, and this is why they're interesting to me, offer a notably reflexive unpicking of the very idea of woman as sick and of sickness as a variety of shameful feminization. So I'm going to start with Hedver's sick woman theory. I'm sure it's a piece that lots of people are really familiar with. It was first published in Mask magazine in 2016. The version that I'm citing is a later version, an extended version from 2022 from the Topical Cream website. And this is a piece that has been especially galvanizing in recent discussions of chronic illness. In this autobiographical essay, Hedver, who is queer, non-binary, and chronically ill with conditions including endometriosis and fibromyalgia, starts from a question about, quote, what modes of protest are afforded to sick and disabled bodies, these other invisible bodies with their fists up, tucked away, out of sight, and develops this into a manifesto which refigures the categories of both sick and woman, such that the shame attaching to both categories is turned outwards into a making visible of vulnerability and of the politics of care. As Hedver explains it, the primary idea was how illness, disability, and vulnerability feminize, e.g., render weaker and more fragile any person, regardless of gender, who requires or is defined by care. Hedver's sick woman, a phrase they tend to capitalize, is not necessarily a cis woman. Rather, their use of woman evokes the cultural resonances of that word and, in turn, reveals the imbrication of femininity and shame. Thus, Hedver writes, to take the term woman as the subject position of this work is a strategic, all-encompassing embrace and dedication to the particular rather than the universal. Though the identity of woman has erased and excluded many, especially women of color and trans, non-binary, gender-fluid people, I choose to use it because it still represents the uncared for, the secondary, the oppressed, the non, the un, the less than. The photos of Hedver accompanying this essay performatively juxtapose their body, supine, feminine in appearance, white passing, with pharmaceutical supplies and works by feminist and queer theorists, including Michel Foucault, Silvia Federici, and Alison Kafer, author of Feminist Queer Crip. In the photos, Woolf's daily drama of the body is foregrounded and put in conversation with an affect-driven theory emerging from feminist and queer spaces, books with which Hedver has a physical, not merely intellectual relationship, and also put in conversation with the politics of the medical industrial complex. The essay moves from the apparently confessional, detailing Hedver's traumatic childhood and numerous health emergencies, to open out into a kind of manifesto. It builds to a repetition of the phrase, the sick woman is, with the subject position in each case being occupied by diverse, disabled, traumatized, and disenfranchised bodies. the elderly or already sick person, a black trans woman, a homeless person, a 50-year-old gay man who was raped as a teenager, a white woman with chronic illness rooted in sexual trauma, a straight man with depression, a black man killed in police custody, the refugee, and so on. All of these people occupy stigmatized positions in society. They are a heterogeneous community of the shamed, these sick women. Their bodies, Hedver says, this peculiar convergence of hyper-visible and invisible, possessed of a dangerous vulnerability. These descriptions, hyper-visible, dangerous vulnerability, speak quite directly to the idea of a shamed subject. Shame is an affect notably concerned with often painful visibility, with structures of looking and being looked at, with objectification, the blush and the averted gaze, with what Tompkins has called the torment of self-consciousness. Hedver, in her listing of these sort of stigmatized subjects, seeks to redefine these historically feminized pathologies into modes of political protest. Hedver's work helps us towards an understanding of sickness as simultaneously a marker of how one feels in relation to some problematically idealized and universalized idea of health, and an indication of one's stigmatized, non-normative social status. In their meditation on the choice of terms informing their putative CRIP phenomenology, Corinne LaJoy and Emily Douglas choose the word sick as their preferred term, thereby, they say, refusing this depoliticization of experiences of illness, madness, and disability. Being sick, on their understanding of it, and on Hedver's, is a political experience in ableist, racist, sexist, sizist, and classist social worlds. So I'm going to go on now to say a little bit about Ill Feelings, a text that Catherine Cheston, of course, spoke about so brilliantly earlier in this series. So I hope that any overlap is productive overlap. In Ill Feelings, Alice Hattrick, who was raised as a girl and, of course, treated accordingly by the medical establishment, but now identifies as non-binary, narrates the story of their mother's struggle with ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, and their own diagnosis, while still a child, with the same condition. The term myalgic encephalomyelitis emerged from descriptions of key outbreaks of mysterious, apparently nervous disorders in the 1930s and 1950s. And the first diagnostic criteria for ME were published in 1986. Meanwhile, in the mid-1980s, as Rebecca Hyman explains, a number of articles appeared in the press describing a new disease. The prevalent symptoms were marked fatigue, joint inflammation, sleep and memory disorder, dizziness, and balance problems. In the absence of physical explanations, writes Hyman, many doctors were sure that what they had named chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS, was partially, if not primarily, a psychological disorder. The names ME and CFS are now used interchangeably, including by patients' organizations. The longer history of so-called nervous disorders to which ME/CFS is frequently connected includes, of course, neurasthenia, hysteria, and conversion disorder. Conversion disorder, of course, is the term that replaced hysteria in the DSM-3 in 1980, and conversion disorder was defined as a psychoneurosis in which bodily symptoms, such as paralysis of the limbs, appear without physical basis. Importantly, such disorders, whether or not the sufferers are women, are nearly always feminized. According to ME Research UK, ME/CFS affects more women than men in a ratio of 4:1. While 21st century research into ME/CFS has explored avenues including immunology and virology, there is still no agreed upon cause of the cluster of symptoms associated with this condition, or even a firm consensus on whether it is primarily physiological or psychological. The 2001 Summary of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome and its classification in the International Classification of Diseases, prepared by the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, describes CFS as, quote, a heterogeneous group of disorders, and notes that, quote, involvement of multiple symptoms has complicated its classification. ME/CFS remains stigmatized, with sufferers shamed as malingerers, mentally ill, or attention-seeking. In the controversial Histories, published in 1997, feminist critic Elaine Showalter placed CFS alongside multiple personality disorder, recovered memory syndrome, alien abduction, satanic ritual abuse, and Gulf War syndrome, describing these as psychological epidemics and imaginary illnesses. In a 2020 essay, Histories Revisited, Showalter does not revise her original argument in any way, instead insisting that what I saw as uncontrollable in the 1990s would become viral by the 2000s. So these are the kinds of contexts in which Hattrick is diagnosed and later reflects on that diagnosis in ill feelings. Hattrick frequently reflects on the shameful feelings surrounding both their illness and their writing of this illness. The text concerns with wider questions of flawed identity, moral badness, painful visibility and influence, viewed as contagion or toxicity, and with the fraught nature of testimony about CFS. All of these things, I think, evoke shame as a kind of appropriate framework for reading this text. Throughout, Hattrick is keenly aware of the ways in which illnesses like CFS are figured as a comment on the person suffering them. It was as if our personalities were sick, they say, of their mother and their childhood self. Later adding, weak, restless, difficult. It is as if the language of the illness I was diagnosed with and the remedies used to treat it was written into my nature. Remember that while guilt concerns something you have done, shame is a bad feeling attaching to what one is, the revelation of a flawed selfhood. I'm quoting Sedgwick in that. It concerns not your actions, but who you are. That is, your deficiencies and inadequacies as a person, as these are revealed to the shaming gaze of the other. And I'm quoting another great theorist on shame there, Ruth Lees. The most explicit connecting of shame and illness by Hattrick occurs in this passage. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time unpacking this. As a child, my body was the place where badness showed itself and made me visible. Shame is the horror of being seen. Shame is toxic, harmful, not healing, or that is what we're told. Shame is what makes you want to disappear, to become invisible in the face of others, as invisible as your illness. As attitudes towards gender, sexuality, and race have shifted, we have learnt to take pride in the ways we identify, to make ourselves visible in order to deny shame its power over us. But if illness is a source of shame, and perhaps even its expression, then that feeling needs to be attended to, not counteracted with pride. Shame, in this sense, is a valuable emotion. Shame is the fact of living a disapproved life, of living a sick life, an internal experience that is measured and judged by others who say, you look well. So sickness and badness are here aligned, the latter implying a kind of moral failing. Shame has often been regarded, particularly in philosophical discourse, as a moral emotion. Its regulatory function compelling us to reflect on ourselves, our behavior, and our relation to others. It also has that function for Freud to some extent. The sickness then reveals that Alice is bad. It is the outer manifestation of an inner badness that has to find a way out somehow. A little later, Hattrick asks, who has not, in times of illness, confused illness with unkindness, sickness with failure and badness? Who has not thought, I have brought this on myself? If this shame is a common element of the medical encounter, so Aaron Lazar, for example, claims that patients often see their diseases and ailments as defects, as inadequacies or personal shortcomings. And he says as well that visits to doctors and medical professionals can involve potentially humiliating physical and psychological exposure. So if that shame is a common element of the medical encounter, it's arguably more acute for CFS patients who have been treated as hypochondriacs or present-day neurasthenics, viewed as somatizers who shape symptoms from cultural and media narratives. And I'm quoting Stella Balaki there. The shame situation is compounded by what Luna Dolezal describes as, quote, an increased tendency in contemporary medicine to moralize about illness and the causes of illness, shifting the onus onto the individual who's responsible for achieving and maintaining his or her own health through various disciplinary lifestyle choices and practices. What's also evident in this passage from Ill Feelings that strikes me is an interesting equivocation over the causal relationship between shame and illness. So this line, if illness is a source of shame and perhaps even its expression, so does the illness cause the shame at being unproductive, at malingering, a word that, of course, means kind of wrong and weak, or is the illness a symptom or an expression of an already existing shame? And if so, what is the cause of that original shame? So shame and illness here, in the way that Hattrick is figuring them, seem to be caught in a kind of fatal reciprocity, each causing or intensifying the other. Hattrick's comments raise the question of what might count as living a sick or a disapproved life. They are brought up by a single mother who is queer, and Hattrick will go on to identify as non-binary. Sickness is implicitly presented here as both an identity and a way of living, but also as something that is inextricable from questions of gender and sexuality. And as they explained in a 2021 interview, the possibility of experimenting with your gender presentation is limited if you have to keep presenting as the good or feminine patient to be believed. Looking back on their childhood spent going with their mother to medical appointments, Hattrick says, she would always be the hysterical mother, and I would be the naughty little girl. In fact, the young Alice is, in her mother's words, not good or feminine, but angry or basically furious through much of their childhood. It is this anger which amounts to a kind of improper femininity that must be cured. The adult Hattrick asks, what if I wanted to stay angry, to stay basically furious? What if I still do? As their comments reveal, however, the feminine patient is always already bad, untrustworthy, weak, hysterical, or naughty, an impression, a kind of primary shame that not even good feminine behavior can dispel. So when Hattrick first reads Elaine Showalter's histories, we're told, I thought of my home and my family, of my mother and I cloistered together. That use of the word cloistered is interesting, I think. Her supposed hysterical reading of her own body and mine, of sickness spread by suggestion, imitation, and alternative therapy, of our ill feelings as a shared language, of the doctors who read our circumstances, poor, queer, female, as toxic and sick, as another symptom that needed to be relieved. Shame is also a sickness spread by suggestion, something contagious and sometimes mysterious, a result perhaps of too much empathy, something toxic. Eve Sedgwick memorably describes shame as, quote, both peculiarly contagious and peculiarly individuating. Later, Hattrick alludes to my mother's illness, which seemed to have infected me, her child. And this language of contagion is everywhere in Ill Feelings, even though MECFS is not, strictly speaking, infectious. But femininity is also presented here as toxic, as producing hysteria when women are cloistered together. As Hattrick acknowledges, from the outside, this kind of influence can seem dangerous. Importantly, in those comments on their childhood, Hattrick also insists that shame needs to be attended to, not counteracted with pride. And here their approach also intersects with Hedver's foregrounding of vulnerability and of the traditionally anti-heroic qualities of what they call idleness, illness, idleness, and inaction. So that feminized position of sickness is a shamed position, but not thereby without agency. So in what ways might shame be a valuable emotion, as Hattrick suggests? In the text under consideration here, I find a willingness to attend to shame, to that particular ill feeling, to inhabit it and explore it, rather than to overcome it or defeat it. This is a non-redemptive approach that might be seen as aligning itself with an understanding of illness and disability as chronic and pervasive, as part of what it means to inhabit a body, as possibly treatable, but probably not curable. In Arthur Frank's influential account of illness narratives, The Wounded Storyteller, he claims that most published illness stories are quest stories, that is, stories that meet suffering head-on, accept illness, and seek to use it, believing that something is to be gained through the experience. I think, though, that Hattrick and Hedver seem to resist the heroism and even the basic sovereignty of self of this kind of quest. So this section has the heading Tainted Witnesses and Sickness Narratives. Tainted Witnesses is an allusion to Lee Gilmore's work on testimony, gender, and autobiography, which I engage with a little more in the longer piece, and which is a very interesting bit of scholarship. Eleanor Cleghorn has written on what she calls the sexist ideology baked into medical thought and practice, asserting that historically we have never been deemed reliable narrators of our pain. Male-dominated medicine's insistence on denying our knowledge of our own bodies has shrouded us in silence and shame. Testimony holds a particular importance in cases of ME, CFS, and fibromyalgia, which may not be physically detectable. In the absence of visible, readable physical symptoms, the patient must describe how she feels. So, at the Alternative Health Centre, writes Hattrick, my mother sat next to me, urging me to speak, because, as with most treatment for physically unexplained illness, you need to be able to say what you are feeling. There is no other test. How we felt did not match up to what could be recorded externally. We didn't look as sick as we said we were. Our testimony was the only proof. But this testimony, of course, is thwarted by the lack of an available language to communicate one's feelings. Hattrick laments that my mother's language for ill feelings is incomprehensible to doctors. It is a metaphorical language at odds with the institutionally medical. And this is something that has come up a lot in the text that I've been looking at, the kind of question of metaphor and the way that metaphor comes into descriptions of health. Berkowitz says over and over again, I feel as though I've been hit by a truck. I feel as though I've been hit by a truck. And is constantly searching for kind of new metaphors to explain what she's feeling and what the doctors don't understand. Hattrick, talking about their mother here, note the feeling of sinking down and down, or white noise surging in your ears, are what most people would probably just call feelings. To my mother, they are symptoms of illness. I still cannot see why they have to be one or the other. The embrace of the inconclusive, the unknown, and the contradictory is telling here, as are the resistance to diagnosis and the validation of feelings which may not meet the external criteria of either illness or knowledge. Feelings have historically been viewed as both epistemically unreliable and illegitimate in a medical context. So Lyons and Dolezal suggest that one explanation for the lack of attention to shame in medical encounters, quote, may lie in the marginal status emotional reactions have within Western medicine, and a consequent tendency to relegate and classify such responses as an irrational subtext. Medicine derives its authority, in part, from the erection of a firm boundary between symptoms of illness and, quote, what most people would just call feelings, between true diseases and psychosomatic illnesses, and that's a distinction that is used by Edward Shorter, who's someone else who writes in a very pathologizing and critical vein about CFS in the 1990s. Hattrick's narrative, I suggest, draws attention to the instability of these divides between symptoms of illness and what most people would call feelings, between true diseases and psychosomatic illnesses. In the illness narratives I've been looking at, hybrid forms that mix autobiography, essay, and theory connect personal experiences to structural historical trends and problems, thereby displacing accusations of narcissism or self-indulgence. They move between the author's own story and the stories of others, longer histories, other texts. Berkowitz intersperses her own narrative of trauma and pain with quotations from works on hysteria, medical journals, theories of trauma, and popular cultural texts. Hedver's sick woman theory, as I showed, originates in their own experience, but expands to include a host of the uncared for and structurally disadvantaged. And the patchwork structure of ill feelings pieces together the histories of different chronic conditions, building its case through juxtaposition and association. As Hattrick writes of their illness and their mothers, our diagnosis and the symptom language we spoke contained the histories of two centuries of gendered illness. It was as if that history was inside our actual bodies. So illness, on this understanding, is not only personal, and the shame attending disputed diagnoses like ME/CFS might then be read as a structural issue rather than a personal failing, even while seeming to render more challenging the formation of allegiances of solidarity and experiences of collectivity. The sick woman is too often isolated, supine. In addition, illness here impacts the very form of the text. Sarah Wasson's work on pain explicitly outlines the need for formal and narratorial innovation in the writing of illness, explaining how, quote, a particular telling of pain requires unsettling certain conventions of writing, of illness expression, and may require disruptions, textual experimentation, and the breaching of what narratives should do and who should tell them. At one point in Ill Feelings, Hattrick is able only to write shorthand fragmentary notes on their phone. And I've put an image up here so that you can see sort of what it looks like on the page. And they're writing like this because they tell us they cannot be anything other than horizontal, cannot go and get my laptop from the living room. So we get these kind of short notes, hands feel swollen, but they're not. Kept awake by hips for 4 nights running, carefully push my thumb into the fleshier part and release pain, being ripped apart from the inside, and so on. These notes are included here, apparently unedited, reminding us that writing is a bodily act and thus hampered by illness. They constitute, Hattrick tells us, another record for my future self, but are radically distinct from my lists of acceptable ways to describe my symptoms in medical contexts. It's precisely in their fragmentariness that they challenge the conventions of acceptable evidence, satisfactory records, and risk the particular shame of literary failure. The deliberate textual incompleteness of various of the texts that make up this subgenre of life writing about illness can be read then as an attempt to match the form of the text to both the situation of sickness, so in other words, a kind of effect of bodily and mental fatigue, fluctuating moods, intermittent pain, brain fog, but also matching the form of the text to the wider political goals of such writing, offering up something that is less coherent and less authoritative than a case study. While Frank argues that stories have to repair the damage that illness has done to the ill person's sense of where she is in life and where she may be going, the stories of Hedver and Hattrick seem less invested in repair, redemption, or closure. Instead, Hattrick challenges the trajectory of the conventional sickness narrative, substituting their own faltering, inconclusive crip time and choosing to focus on what they call unrecovery, because some of us still do not know what we need to recover from, and because unrecovery holds the potential for crip pain and crip joy. That acceptance of unrecovery, along with the reclaiming, following Alison Kafer, of the word crip, forms part of what I presented here as Hedver and Hattrick's willingness to sit with their ill feelings, including the feeling of shame, rather than trying to overcome them, to resist that imperative, get well soon, to find or make forms adapted to the experience and expression of their sickness, and to connect these feelings to social structures and systems that extend far beyond their own personal autobiographies and illnesses. In doing so, they contest what Kaye has deemed the ableist assumption that, quote, a good future naturally and obviously depends on the eradication of disability, end quote, rather than on a better understanding of care, vulnerability, and the grey area between feelings and symptoms that we will all inhabit at some point. For, as Hedva explains, the definition of a body is its vulnerability and reliance on infrastructures of support. To require care, to be sick, to be vulnerable, is not an aberration, but the norm. To be well is the oddity. In this way, we are all, or will all be, at some point in our lives, sick women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaye. That was so fascinating. I can see that's a Zoom clapping. That's brilliant. Thank you. So I'd just like to open up the space to questions. Feel free to put the questions in the chat box, and we're happy to read them out, or to raise your hand. And while you perhaps collect your thoughts, if no one has any burning questions to ask now, I'll just check. Perhaps I might start us off, if that's all right. So I was thinking about, slightly haven't quite formulated a complete string of thought in my head, but about your in writing Shame, I really like how you talk about, and you mentioned a bit today, about this kind of traditional thought of writing shame as catharsis, like Arthur Frank's, slightly similar to Arthur Frank's idea of sort of stories as healing. I guess it's this sort of idea of telling stories of shame to sort of purge yourself of shame. I really like your how you write about that and write shame, and I often cite it. But I was also thinking about what you mentioning about the kind of hybrid genre, this genre of autobiography which mixes autobiographical writing and essay and various forms of nonfiction. And I guess I've been wondering how that fits together. And obviously Hattrick ends, to use Hattrick example, with unrecovery and the kind of continuation, but I'm wondering if there is a sort of element of resistance in the hybrid form, and whether it is perhaps a way of writing back to shame, or at least to these kind of social, I think you mentioned the social structures of shame. I'm particularly interested in this because I noticed that there are a lot of memoirs about MECFS, particularly, that are this hybrid form. And since, it's become, there's quite a lot now, but, even in 2005, there was Dorothy Wall published a kind of hybrid memoir. Yeah, I just wondered if you had any more thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think I do see a kind of resistance happening there. On the sort of redemption issue, I think it was really central to the Writing Shame book that I wanted to look at texts that that didn't take a sort of redemptive approach to shame. And I found that what limited critical writing there was on literature and shame tended to always talk about that kind of cathartic thing of, writing is what helps us escape shame. And that seemed to me a fundamental misunderstanding of what shame is and how it works, because we don't want to be completely free of it. I mean, it's to be shameless is not a good thing either. At the same time, of course, we don't want to be kind of limited or paralyzed by it. So I thought, and it seemed to me that writing, because of its I suppose its ability to inhabit sort of states of ambiguity, because of its sort of intersubjective nature and the way that it brings the reader into that and can involve a kind of reader complicity, was this fantastic arena for kind of working through shame, but not working through it to some end where it's over, we've got rid of it, we are free of shame. I think with you're so right that there's a sort of explosion of kind of hybrid writing across the board in recent years, and it does particularly seem to be something that is evident in the writing of illness. And I think there is a kind of resistance to, as I was saying at the end there, I think these are texts that really don't want to present themselves as case studies of the kind that sort of set out a narrative that tells you this is why the person is this way, or this is how it has come about, that try to resist that sort of causality and temporality. I think also part of what I sort of cut out to make this shorter, I think there's a lot of kind of societal critique happening in all of these texts, all of the ones that I've looked at so far. And that, again, I think is something that interests me about how shame works, that shame, we think of shame as being incredibly personal, but it's also structural, and it's sort of both at the same time. So that's, I see that as something that is evident in the way that these texts are, Hattrick talking about these sort of histories of gendered illness, and that it is as if they were within our bodies. So your body is sort of also the product of what has gone before. Obviously, writers like Anne Boyer and Johanna Hedver, write more explicitly about the kind of conditions of late capitalism and how they also produce illness as a sort of, both a kind of toxic world that we inhabit that might be making us sick in various respects, but also produce illness as a kind of category that some people are then compelled to inhabit. So I think particularly where we get this kind of mixing of this sort of intertextuality, bringing in of quotations from other sources and so on, I think that's also a way of trying to step away from something that is seen as purely confessional. Because again, I think confession as a sort of narrative mode always has that double-edged sense of being, as I said, brave or a bit shaming, and the idea of oversharing is a very gendered idea. I don't know if that answers your question, Catherine. It felt very rambling.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, let's think about in terms of confession and genre. Thank you. Does anyone have any additional questions? Arthur.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, Sasha, do you want to go? I don't want to abuse chair's privilege, so co-chair's privilege.
Sure, I can go. Sorry about my appearance. I'm actually tuning in from Australia, so it's 10 to 11 right now. But I'd like to thank you, Kaye, for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne, and I'm researching how shame is like an important tool of regulating femininity. Particularly, I'm looking as like pop music fangirls as my like case study. And I was just sort of wondering, because I'm also like approaching shame from this idea of it, not viewing shame in this like remedial therapeutic view of like something that you need to move beyond in order to like truly be yourself. I was wondering, because this is my first time like hearing about disability studies and this idea of the sick woman. I was wondering about like this idea of authenticity and shame, and how sometimes it's like sort of framed as like incongruous to have shame and still be or have an authentic self. I was just wondering if ideas about authenticity came up in these texts at all.
I don't know authenticity exactly, but I think what there is, and what is sort of produced by narratives that are engaging with feelings and experiences of shame, is what I would call slightly differently a kind of disruption of the kind of sovereignty of self, of seeing the self as, a sort of sovereign subject who is able to, to act in very clear ways, or who has that sort of agency and coherence and stability. And I think that says something about the relation of shame to subjecthood. And again, there's quite a lot of that within kind of philosophical discourse, particularly that shame is partly what forms the subject, but it's also what kind of undoes the subject in various ways. I think also I'm interested that you're thinking about kind of questions of regulation, because this was, again, something that I was trying to think about in writing Shame, about how, because when we talk about shame as a kind of regulator, as regulating our behavior, that's seeing it as something that is coming from outsiders or sort of being imposed by society in a certain way, and which I think is certainly happens, and I think and there are particular ways in which both femininity and masculinity are regulated, slightly different ways, I think. but then we also talk about shame as coming from sort of within us somehow, and as involving a kind of self-consciousness. The suggestion is that very small children don't feel shame. They start to feel shame at a certain point, and it's sort of part of the socialization process that way, I think. I wonder whether trauma comes into what you're writing about, because that for me maybe connects to the question of authenticity slightly more closely, where sometimes, trauma narratives can be presented as a way of sort of finding the kind of truth of the self. It does so in Amy Berkowitz's book Tender Points, she traces sort of everything back to one experience of sexual abuse when she was a child, sexual abuse by a medical professional, actually, when she was a child, and sort of circles around that as something that might provide the key. And I think she even uses the word key, the key to her pain. And also, I think in some ways, the kind of key to her identity, or the key to her sort of sick identity as she's older. So I think that is there in some of these narratives, and in narratives that maybe deal more explicitly with trauma, that there is perhaps a view of the sort of the self as kind of produced by that traumatic incident somehow, or the trauma as the kind of truth of the self. I'm very wary of any suggestion of the truth of the self, as is probably obvious. But I'm interested in the kinds of stories that people are telling themselves about the truth of the self, certainly.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for your question and for tuning in from late night and far away.
Thanks so much. Arthur, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, and if nobody else is going to ask, I really liked. I mean, I loved your talk, Kaye. As I loved your book, I was sort of wondering, in that though, whether there was some way of creating more friction between Hedva and Hattrick. So I guess you sort of one of those kind of, like, if you don't have a good question in shame studies, kind of ask a question about the distinction between shame and shaming, or ask a question about the distinction between shame and stigma. So in keeping with that, not having a good question, I'm going to ask a question about shame and stigma, and will hopefully disguise that it's a bad question in kind of referring to kind of Hedva Hattrick, who's kind of interested in the way in which so much of sick woman theory is about a kind of evocation of a visual dimension and a kind of marking. I guess maybe not so much visual in a kind of naive sense, but just a kind of marking of identities as kind of structured by the way in which people will see those identities. When so much of, and I haven't read Hattrick, but from what your and Catherine's descriptions, Hattrick, their evocation is always about the withdrawal of sight, or the kind of moving away from sight. So while shame is a kind of being seen, as you kind of very elegantly sort of unpacked in referring to the quote, there is also the sense of, oh, you've got to speak it out because nobody can see, there are no tests that can get to that thing. And so I was just wondering whether, like, maybe Hedva's, and it kind of is part of the background of my question, is this kind of sociological debate that goes on where the sociologists really don't want to talk about shame, so much so that Graham Scambler invents kind of felt stigma to refer to shame so that he doesn't have to use the word shame. And, Imogen Tyler, of course, writes a book which is about stigma, which is very much about shame. And in some ways, there was something interesting in your paper that you were almost resisting the urge to ever talk about stigma, whereas so much of Hedva seems to be about marking and stigma. And so, I don't know, can you make anything of that rather rambly kind of?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. I think my sort of first thought would be that I agree that I think Hedva is much more focused on stigma. I think partly because Hedva is writing something which is in a way a slightly different genre to what Hattrick is doing. And I described it a couple of times as a manifesto. And I think, and it's deliberately provocative. I mean, I think that kind of list of, the sick woman is, and then all of these different subjects that Hedva gives us. So I think it is a much more sort of angry and defiant, polemical type of piece, which is particularly concerned with social stigmatization. And I suppose I mean I would also think about kind of Goffman's work, I suppose, on the kind of the stigmatized subject as well. Hattrick, I think, is coming from a slightly different perspective of trying to filter their experience through these other sort of histories and stories. I think the visual aspect is still there, but I think it's a text that is more about trying to kind of explore their situation and their mothers without coming to any conclusion, really, without sort of saying this is what's caused it, or this is how to get beyond it, or do I even want to get beyond it? So, and I think it's, in that sense, it is more personal, maybe, I don't know. Although there is very much a kind of societal critique element to it. And I think Hedva is much more interested in, categories of persons as they appear to others, which, yes, is, I mean, I think stigma and shame overlap significantly, but yeah, that's really, thank you. The kind of the idea of being marked is, I think, is something I could bring out more in that analysis and in distinctions between them. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's super interesting hearing these tensions being brought up between shame and stigma. I think we might have time for, perhaps we do. Do we have time for one who has a very quick question? Perhaps, as it's 1 minute to 2 p.m, I wonder if I should perhaps conclude, which is a shame, because I have lots of burning questions about the mysterious female bodies and things like that. Thank you, but yes, thank you so much, Kaye. That was such a fascinating talk, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this seminar and to our others in our series. It's been really brilliant to have these conversations with you, and you'll be able to watch the recordings of the other seminars, but also of Kaye's seminar will be in, I think, perhaps a few weeks. So that'll be on the Shame Medicine website. But yeah, thank you so much, Kaye. Thank you to everyone. It's been great to see you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Catherine, for chairing, and thanks for some great questions.